Thank you for having me. Saudi Arabia's economy has obviously undergone huge changes over the past couple of years with low oil prices. And I thought I'd start there with this talk and discuss this sort of short-term adjustment to oil at 50-60. And what we've seen when oil hit its nadir of $28 a barrel early last year, we saw a lot of concerns that Saudi Arabia's dollar peg would be abandoned. It simply wasn't sustainable anymore. What we've actually seen is the Saudi authorities embark on what a lot of people in this country would know as fiscal austerity. And what we've seen is subsidy reform. We've seen introduction of taxes, for example, on so-called sin taxes, and also tax on land. More than anything, though, we've seen significant spending cuts. And this has been shown up particularly in the construction sector, where there's actually been some bankruptcies of Saudi construction companies. There's been a lot of pain. The economy actually contracted in Q2 by 1% year on year. But the flip side to that is the adjustment is now almost there. Saudi Arabia is, in the short term at least, adjusted to $60 oil. And what we've seen is the decline in foreign exchange reserves has slowed. And then we've got the IMF coming out and saying that Saudi Arabia should slow the pace of austerity over the coming years. But as a lot of other people have mentioned, Vision 2030 is what Mohammed bin Salman has deemed key is to transforming the Saudi economy into a modern economy away from dependence on oil. And I must say, this is clearly the most comprehensive reform package we have seen from the kingdom in many decades. We've seen national development plans before, but this has targets, specific policies, key performance indicators that Mohammed bin Salman keeps banging on about. Now, I think there's two key aims with Vision 2030. One is to reduce the government's dependence on oil revenues. Second is to kickstart the development of the non-oil private sector, not the non-oil government sector, the non-oil private sector. Now, just to give some context, the Saudi economy is still very heavily dependent on oil. It accounts for half of total economic output. 3/4 of export revenues come from oil, and obviously most of those flow to the government. Now, some did point to previous rapid growth in the non-oil private sector during the 2000s as a sign of diversification away from oil. But I think that forgets that what underpinned that was rapid government spending funded out of oil revenues. That was not a sign the economy is transforming away from oil. Now, the reason diversification is so important in Saudi Arabia is the huge demographic bulge. Now, just to provide some numbers, obviously a lot of people have mentioned this, but half of the population is under the age of 25. The population is expected to rise by a quarter by 2030, one of the steepest rises in the emerging world, only below the likes of Nigeria, for example. And that stands in stark contrast to other countries in Asia and emerging Europe where populations are actually declining. And just to put another figure out there, up to 5.5 million new workers could be joining the Saudi labour force by 2030. Now, the government is clearly no longer in a financial position to absorb this huge amount of workers. And actually, the National Transformation Plan, which comes under Vision 2030, under that, Mohammed bin Salman wants to cut the Saudi civil service by 20%. Now, so we need to transition towards where the non-oil private sector is the key driver of the economy. And there's been a few constraints on the non-oil private sector, which I'll quickly outline. One is you've got this big dominant oil sector, and that drains resources away from the non-oil private sector. But I think poor economic policy making for several decades has played a key role too. So some people have mentioned already the education system. Saudi Arabia actually spends quite a significant amount on education, about 5% of GDP if I remember rightly. But the problem is the outcomes are poor. Saudi nationals tend to score very poorly on international assessments, for example. And also it's exacerbated by the poor quality of teachers in Saudi Arabia. Just to take one example, and this is outlined in the Vision 2030 and National Transformation Plan, fewer than half of teachers in Saudi Arabia meet the government's own guidelines for teaching standards. Another issue is the large government projects, large construction projects. These have enabled firms and families closely aligned to the royal family to extract large rents. And that has prompted a shift in the Saudi economy over many decades towards low productivity sectors such as construction. And it also means that because there's been Saudi companies have been able to access a large pool of migrant workers, there's been little incentive for these firms to actually train up Saudi nationals to do these jobs. Another issue is the poor business environment. People have touched on this again. Large amounts of red tape, a bloated bureaucracy where firms have to go through so-called brokers in order to get things done. These brokers have access to ministers and people in high-level positions in government. Excuse my Arabic, but I think it's known as wasta in the kingdom. And many foreign firms also have to seek out local partners in order to set up operations in the kingdom. And the result of that, as we see foreign direct investment into Saudi, for example, is particularly low by international standards. And one final issue on the business environment is small and medium enterprises are actually, a lot of them are actually illegal. They're run by migrant workers, but legally they're owned, or it's called tazatur. It's you get, say, retail companies that are run by migrant workers but have to be set up under the name of the Saudi, and in return the Saudi receives a fee or share of the profits from the from the migrant worker. One consequence of all of this is that Saudi nationals tend to seek employment in the public sector. High wages in government jobs there are, favourable working hours, at the same time we also have generous welfare benefits. So for a lot of Saudi nationals it's better to just wait for a government job to come up and in the meantime live on welfare. And this is epitomised by the higher unemployment rate among Saudi nationals. Now, Vision 2030, like I say, very comprehensive reform package, but it falls short in a number of areas, and I won't go into too much detail. One is a lack of emphasis on developing non-oil export sectors. That's been a key way other emerging markets have sort of developed their economies, exporting to rich markets, for example. The other issue is the government has shied away from a major overhaul of the education system. And that means you won't tackle the issues that mean there's low productivity among Saudi nationals. Another issue unrelated to that is then the government hasn't done enough to try to close the wage gap between Saudi and migrant workers. And finally, they're not tackling the major issues that make the business environment so poor. Now, over the past month, we've obviously seen two major developments that have an obvious impact on the Saudi economy. The first is the announcement of Lyon, this so-called new economic city, which is going to be the size of a small country such as Rwanda. Now, Saudi, I think, as Bill might have mentioned earlier, has a very poor form with mega projects, and the King Abdullah economic city is a clear example of that. Just to put some, I mean, it was meant to rival Dubai as a trading hub. But just some statistics for you. Shipping statistics show that just 11 ships were docked at the King Abdullah economic city a few weeks ago. Dubai Jebel Ali has 54. And another one is King Abdullah economic city was meant to have 2 million residents. It has 5,000. The other key development we've seen is obviously, and one we've been talking about throughout today, is the anti-corruption clampdown. Now, this is clearly an attempt by Mohammed bin Salman to consolidate his power and boost his popularity among the Saudi population. And it comes alongside other measures such as allowing women to drive. And corruption is a major issue in the kingdom. Right? We won't. That's clearly obvious. But the corruption clampdown has raised hopes that having a stronger grip on power means that Mohammed bin Salman can push through Vision 2030. But actually, there's concerns here. One is it deters foreign investment, which he's actually trying to court. The biggest risk, and one we've talked about quite a lot here, is there is a backlash against Mohammed bin Salman. And I think he's clearly moving away from a consensus-based policy making, which has been a key part of the kingdom for quite a period. And if there was a backlash, that would undermine his authority and threaten Vision 2030. Now, the upshot to all of this is that we think Vision 2030 actually will fall short of quite a lot of its lofty goals. And economic growth in the kingdom is likely to remain extremely weak for some time. And consequence of that is the unemployment rate among Saudi nationals is currently 10 to 12%. If there isn't stronger reform, that could rise to 20% by 2030. And unemployment was obviously a major issue in the Arab Spring uprisings, weak growth as well, corruption. So there's obvious connotations here for Saudi Arabia and what it could mean for the kingdom's future. I'll leave it there, and if there's any questions you want to raise on the Saudi economy, I'm more than happy to take them.